So, yeah, I'm here to talk to you about regional variation in the grammar of English dialects. And to kick us off talking about this topic, I have a very sort of fundamental question for you, which is, what is a dialect? So, if you're able to hear okay, maybe you can put in the chat suggestions. So, teachers, if you can get responses from your students and then relay them in the chat, and then we'll have a look and see what you think. So just immediate sort of reaction, what do you think of as a dialect? um, how would you define it if you had to? Maybe it's not so clearly defined, but is there anything that you would think of when you think of a dialect? What how would you describe it? See something in the chat. Speech that we might associate with your region, background, etc. The words you say, not necessarily accent. Okay, yeah. So this captures a few key points. Yeah. So we can think of it as a variety of a language. Often it's thought of as being regional. So yeah, what it's a variety of a language, often a regional one. One exception is standard English. So, although you might not think of it as a dialect, we could think of it as a dialect because it's a variety of English. It just happens to be the standard one. And that's kind of an exception because it doesn't have such a strong regional association, unlike some other dialects. And uh, one of the things we can say is that non-standard dialects are associated with everyday casual speech, though this might vary from person to person. So some people might speak standard English all the time and not really style shift very much. Some people might speak more, use more non-standard forms with, say, friends or family, but then in maybe more formal settings, they might move more towards standard English. So for most people, I think it's kind of that continuum where you adjust depending on the situation. And generally, dialect refers mainly to grammar and vocabulary. Sometimes it's thought of alongside pronunciation. So if we're talking about, say, the Yorkshire dialect, we might think of it as a variety as a whole, in which case pronunciation would come into it. But dialect captures grammar and vocabulary, whereas if we were to say Yorkshire accent, say, that would just refer to pronunciation on its own. So that's an important terminology distinction to make. So when we're thinking about variation within England, one of the more well-known sort of thing concepts, if you like, is the idea of a north-south divide. And this has been characterized as the most significant linguistic distinction within England. So if you look to this map on the right hand side, you see roughly where this divide might land for a lot of linguistic features. It's this line, if you can see my cursor, from Lincolnshire, that goes across the Midlands and finishes at the Welsh border. Now, the exact placement of this line is going to, shift depending on which features we're talking about. But this map was put together by aggregating a bunch of, linguistic features together, and this is the sort of main, line, if you like. We sometimes call this an isogloss, this line where it marks a different way of speaking. But in reality, obviously, it's less of a divide and more of a continuum. So we have a school here from the East Midlands, and obviously the Midlands is kind of a transition area between the north and south. And so for some features, you may have more sort of northern-like pronunciations. For other things, you might sound more like people from the southeast, say. So it's not, that it's such a clear-cut divide. But I'm curious, can you think of any particular linguistic features that might pattern in this way? So is there anything that you can think of that would differentiate north from south, say, or is there anything that would differentiate Midlands from the south, or North and Midlands versus South? Anything at all. So it could be a pronunciation thing, could be lexis, or it could be grammatical. So if you could put your suggestions in the chat, that would be great, and we can see some examples. So we have a suggestion, slang lexis. Okay, so how would this pattern on a north-south dimension? Do you think it's more common in the north or opposite? We've got H dropping in Bradford. Okay, so maybe that's like something that you associate with one particular area. Grass or grass, yeah. So, Bath, grass, path is the kind of northern form. In the south, it'd be like Bath, grass, path. Um, Dark L in the south. Okay, yeah. Um, Dark, yeah. L's are interesting because sometimes it depends on where the L is in the word. So if it's at the start of the word, like leaf, it's typically what we call light L, versus something like film, where it's a dark L. So it's light versus dark depends on um, the tongue position, basically. But some places, like I'm from the northeast, and it's said that L's are generally lighter in the northeast. There's definitely variation. Okay, great. So yeah, there's good few suggestions here. I think the grass one is quite a well known sort of north south divider. We've got glottal stops will becoming more universal. Yeah, definitely. I mean that one's quite common in lots of different places now. I think at one time it used to get associated with the southeast in particular, but now much more common, and um maybe more class based variation than regional per se. Um, some places probably use it more than others, though. But yeah, these are great examples. And what you might have noticed actually in I think all of those examples, except for the slang lexis, so that's lexis, all the rest you mentioned are phonetic accent based things. So this connects to my next slide, which is that often when we talk about the north-south divide, we talk about it in relation to accent, which we've just been doing. And there's many reasons why this might be the case, but often it's thought that grammatical variation is less of a social marker than accent. So if you hear somebody talking, it's probably the accent that tells you more clearly where they're from than the grammar necessarily. And so the question I'm asking today and in my research at the moment is the north-south divide as relevant to grammatical variation, or is there other, and other clusters of regional differences that are more relevant? So this is related to the project that you did a survey as part of, so the project's interactions in grammatical systems, north-south dialect variation in England. And so yeah, this is looking at grammatical variation in particular, so not accent, but how different grammatical features might interact with each other in a kind of structural sense grammatically, but also regionally, whether they cluster together and whether we see north-south patterns because that has been claimed for some of these features, or whether actually it's maybe a bit more complex for grammar than it is for accent. So as I say, it did a survey for me, which was a survey designed to elicit acceptability judgments. And you may not have come across this term before, but basically acceptability judgments are people's reports about their intuitions about language, particularly their acceptability of the language. So if we have a sentence like, he had seen not the cat, most native English speakers would say, no, that's not part of my grammar, not acceptable. Sometimes in linguistic publications, we would mark this with an asterisk to indicate that. But if we had a sentence like, he hadn't seen the cat, we'd probably tick that and say, yeah, that's fine. Now, it becomes more tricky when we're dealing with features that are non-standard in some dialects of English, so not part of the standard English, because if we ask them to respond in a binary way like this, is it acceptable or not, it might be more difficult to get a sort of straightforward answer. So what we might do in these circumstances is elicit gradient judgments. So we can do that using what's called a Likert scale, where we have a numeric scale of 1 to 5, say, or it could be 1 to 7 or whatever you like. And here you rate a sentence from 1 to 5 according to how it could be, you can word the actual question in different ways, but in the survey you did, it was how frequently do you use this sentence? And 1 means never and 5 means very frequently. So the higher the number, the more frequent you use it. So, question for you to respond to it in the chat is, why might we use a survey rather than recording people? So in the project, we actually have done some interviews as well, in 4 UK cities, but we also did a survey. So what do you think the benefits are of doing a survey as opposed to recording people, in terms of practicalities, but also the kind of data that you might get? So in the chat we have, you can reach more people. Yeah, definitely. Much faster. Yeah, for sure. The surveys, with modern technology, we can send it out online and get responses quite quickly. Avoids observers paradox. Yeah, brilliant. So if anyone's not familiar with this term, this is the fact that in sociolinguistics, say we want to record people's natural vernacular, the way they talk, at their most relaxed and casual. But as soon as you put a record in front of them, they'll naturally go to tense up and not speak exactly the same way. So this is the observer's paradox. Whereas with the survey, we don't necessarily have that same level of problem. I mean, it's still kind of there, because sometimes people don't like reporting using non-standard forms necessarily, but it definitely reduces it down quite a bit. So other suggestions: technology means it's easier to access. Yeah, definitely. And people feel more comfortable. Yeah. Because getting someone to do a 5-10 minute survey is a lot more straightforward than sitting down with someone, and a lot of the time in sociolinguistics, we are recording people for at least half an hour or maybe an hour or so. So it's a lot more time out of their day, and they might not want to be recorded necessarily. Whereas a survey, there isn't that same level of um participation, if you see what I mean. So so most of the things I had on the slide have been touched on. So it's definitely more efficient to collect data at a large scale. Less time consuming, less intrusive for participants. Another factor is that if we want to collect data on some linguistic feature that's quite rare, we could record 100 people for an hour each, and this one feature might never come up, just because it's rare, and so people happen not to use it in the recording. In which case we've invested a lot of time into that, but we haven't got the reward as such. But in a survey, you can design the sentences that you want judgments on to get that information. So that's one key benefit. And also, we can obtain what we call negative evidence. So we can get knowledge of the context where forms not only just can be used and are frequently used, but also where they can't. Because if we had one linguistic form and we want to compare it in two different linguistic contexts, if people rate one of them much higher on the scale than the other, this tells us something interesting about where forms are more likely to be used. Whereas in a corpus, if corpus being an archive of texts, so either written or spoken, we don't get the same negative evidence. We only have kind of positive evidence. We just get what's in the corpus. You can't ask the people, could you use this form in a different context? So these are some of the benefits of doing a survey. And in the survey that you completed, you saw 4 blocks of 12 sentences that were pseudo-randomized. So what that means is the sentences were mixed up in a random order, but sometimes if 2 sentences ended up next to each other that were very similar, I then mixed it up a little bit more, because sometimes just having 2 very similar sentences next to each other means it affects the ratings because people start comparing them. Whereas ideally I wanted people to look at each sentence individually and not sort of think about how it related to other sentences nearby. And the survey tests a range of features, all grammatical features of some kind, on their own, or sometimes in combination. So in combination, where you had a sentence with 2 features of interest in the same sentence, basically. And I'll talk about an example of that towards the end of the talk. There were also some filler sentences. So these are sentences that weren't sort of a primary interest for my project, but were just other grammatical features that might be of interest to look at. And this also included one sentence that you may have found particularly odd, which was something like "where go would like you," which was purposefully designed to be written in a way that there's no dialect that I'm aware of where that would be possible. And so it was put in there as a kind of check to see if people were paying attention. So people who gave that a 4 or 5, indicating they use it very frequently, that data is being excluded, because it indicates they maybe were kind of clicking quite randomly, not paying full attention. And sure enough, overall, out of all of the sentences, that sentence was the out of 48 sentences that had the absolute lowest average rating. So that goes to show most people did find it unacceptable, as I would expect. So just a reminder, this is what you saw. So you had rate these sentences on a scale. You had the sentences in bold, and then they were each in a little scenario that helped disambiguate anything that could have maybe had more than one interpretation. But it was mainly the sentence in bold that you were judging. So this is the current sample. This is taken towards the end of October. There's just over 1,000 responses from people from the UK. This excludes anybody who said they grew up outside the UK. Also, because the project focuses on England, most of the data is from England, just because that's what I'm mainly looking at. So that's why there aren't many responses from Northern Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. And you see through the English regions, they're listed roughly north to south. Most of them have at least 50 or so participants, sometimes a lot more. So Yorkshire and the Humber is in the lead, probably for obvious reasons, because that's where I'm based at the moment. Over 300, but you have some like say the Southwest, and also West Midlands, where I'd like to try and get some more responses, just so that it kind of evens out a little bit more. It's never going to be exactly even, but just the more data, the better, basically. So yeah, so feel free to share it more widely. Just don't tell people what you know at the end of the talk, because then you are in on the secret basically at the end of the talk, and you can see what it's all about. But yeah, if you know people to share it to, please feel free. So yeah, so the first set of results I'm going to talk about are about something called negative concord. I don't know how familiar you are with this term. Sometimes in sort of general public discourse, it's called a double negative. Um, so a negative concord is basically where you have two negatives in the sentence, but they contribute a single negative meaning. So if we said, I didn't do nothing, it's where that sentence means I didn't do anything. So this is very common in non-standard dialects of English worldwide. It's just not found in the standard. And one terminology distinction we can make is that linguists distinguish negative concord from what they call double negation. Okay, so although we think about this as a double negative, actually linguists differentiate the two, where double negation is part of standard English. So if we take the same sentence, I didn't do nothing, but it means instead I did something, then that's an example of double negation. So an example would be somebody said, oh, we've just been lazing around not doing anything today. You see, I didn't do nothing. I tidied the cupboards, and washed the car, or whatever. So then there, you maybe it's often with a stressed nothing, right? I didn't do nothing. Then that's double negation. So that's slightly different. And so when sentences like the one in the speech bubble here were presented in the survey, the scenario made it clear that we were talking about a negative concord meaning rather than a double negation meaning. And that's reflected in the ratings as well, because the ratings were quite low, which is no surprise because this is a non-standard construction. So what are the hypotheses or predictions for this feature? Well, one of the sort of common patterns is that negative concord is more widely used by working class people as opposed to middle class people, and that's been found in studies of language use in corpora, in archives of speech. And then negative concord will be more frequent in the south of England than the north or Midlands, and this comes from data again from older sort of spoken recordings. And the Cheshire Owl study was a acceptability judgment survey, but it went out to teachers at schools around the country and were asked, would you hear this in your area? But on the whole, this claim comes from quite old data. So even though some of these studies were published in the 2000s, the data is actually older than that. So one Annaval used in one of her publications, she used the British National Corpus, which is from the 1990s. A couple of the other studies used a corpus called Fred, Freiburg English dialect corpus, and most of their recordings are from the 70s, but it does span a few decades. So here's the results from the survey for negative concord. So I've just put an example sentence, he wasn't doing nothing, just so you can remember what kind of sentence we're talking about here, but there were a bunch more than just that one. And we have the English regions down the left, roughly from north to south. And then social class is middle class in the red, and then working class in the blue. So this is just data from people who said they were one of these classes. Some people said I don't know what my class is or described it in some other way. So they're not part of this right now, but in future I'd like to look at those speakers as well for this, just to see how they fit in with this pattern. And then we have the dots represent the mean average rating from 1 to 5. So the higher the number, the more common people found it, the more often they said they would use it. And then the bars that you see through the dots are what we call error bars. So it's kind of a measure of statistical reliability for the average. And sometimes when you see a longer bar, like in, say, through the working class speakers for West Midlands and South West, that indicates that there's maybe less data for that category compared to some others, or the individuals don't agree necessarily in their ratings. But where the error bars are shorter, it shows more confidence in the average. It's to do with if we were to resample the regions, how likely is it we'd get a similar result. So smaller bars equals more accurate measure. So what can we see from this data? Well, the most obvious thing is that the blue dots representing the working class speakers are almost everywhere except the East Midlands more highly rated than the middle class. So working class speakers say that they would use negative concord more than the middle class participants. So East Midlands is the only exception to this, and you see how the dots are kind of overlapping. So there's less of a class difference in this for this phenomenon, negative concord, than there is elsewhere. I'm curious as to why that is. If you have suggestions, those of you who are in the East Midlands, let me know. But I will have to look into obviously individual ratings and try and figure out what's going on there, because that's quite an interesting result. So what about the regional difference? So the top 5 regions are North and Midlands. And the suggestion was that negative concord would be less common there than it would be in the South. So if that were true, we'd expect the dots in these regions to be further to the left of the graph, lower on the scale, than these regions, which are in the south of England. So we'd expect those to be further to the right, larger ratings, higher ratings. But looking at this, it doesn't look like there's a clear pattern in that direction, right? There's definitely variation. The gap between the classes can sometimes differ, but there isn't a clear North and Midlands versus South distinction. So how can we sum up the main findings here? Well, we know that negative concord is a very striking, perhaps the most striking difference between non-standard and standard varieties of English. So it's not surprising that it's rated as more frequent among working class speakers than middle class speakers, because middle class speakers tend not to use it, and they may also not want to report using a stigmatized construction. The gap between the class ratings might vary regionally, as we've seen. The next step that I'd like to do is compare ratings by education or occupation and see how that fits in, because this class-based distinction was based on how people self-reported class. And if we look at education, occupation, it might be that there's even, could be an even sharper divide possibly. So that's for next steps. What about the regional variation? Well, the results generally don't support the previous claims that this is more common in the South. And as I alluded to earlier, some of these older claims are based on data sets that are imbalanced, or the analysis doesn't take social class into account. So for instance, Andeval uses the British National Corpus, which is from the 1990s, but she acknowledges in her work on this that the British National Corpus is actually quite imbalanced for social class and region together. So that some regions you have more working class speakers, some regions you have more middle class speakers. and the amount of information that's given about that is sometimes a bit lacking. So it can be hard to know whether it's a true regional pattern or not. Whereas we've seen from the survey that class is, an important aspect of this variation. Okay, and so that they're the results for negative concords, and then now I'm turning to another phenomenon which you might have spotted in the survey as you went through, which is to do with contraction. So contraction is if, say, someone said, "Is he going to the party?" and you wanted to say no, you could say he's not going. You could say he isn't going. In some dialects, you might say he ain't going. So there's at least three options available to us. And all of these options, we also have full options like he is not going, right? But the contracted forms are where we have a shortening or combination of two words, and in writing, it's often marked with an apostrophe. So auxiliary contraction would be the example like he's not, where it's the is, the verb, that's being contracted onto the pronoun in this case, and the not stands on its own. But we have the other option of negative contraction or not contraction, where not becomes nt and it attaches to the verb, so it's he isn't. And then the other option would be he ain't, which is it's been argued is a kind of phonetic or phonological reduction of isn't. So we have at least these three options, and there are some more predictions based on previous literature that we can make about this this variable. A variable being a set of items that mean the same thing. So one hypothesis from Peter Trudgill, who's a famous sociolinguist, I'm sure you will have come across his work, or at least will come across his work in the future. He suggested in the 70s that auxiliary contraction might be more frequent the further north you go within the UK. There's also work to suggest that auxiliary contraction is preferred over negative contraction for the verb be, so that basically, given the choice between he's not or he isn't, people tend to say he's not. But the opposite is true for the verb will. So he won't is preferable than he'll not. But in work done by Sally Tagliamonte and Jennifer Smith, they did a study of various UK locations and suggested that there was more regional variation for this verb than some others. And then lastly, ain't is more common in the South or Midlands than the North. So what do we see in the survey? So again, I'll just talk you through what we're looking at here. So we've got the English regions down the left from north to south. We've got the results for B. So this is basically is not in this case. And we have three contraction types. So we have neg contraction, which is he isn't. Auxiliary contraction, which is he's not. And then ain't is ain't. So we've got the pink is neg contraction, green auxiliary contraction, blue is ain't. And so for B, we see firstly the neg and the auxiliary contraction are rated pretty much the same. The dots are practically on top of each other in every single place. There's always some degree of overlap. Sometimes it's absolutely bang on the same. And you see how consistently people seem to rate this because the error bars are so small. Also, when you look for a regional pattern, doesn't seem to be much. I mean, if anything, it seems slightly more common in the south, which is kind of the opposite of what Trudgill suggested, but pretty consistent otherwise. And then ain't is rated much lower, which is what we'd expect because it's the only non-standard variant. but there's a little bit more regional variation. So, for instance, it's a little bit more common in London, it seems, than some other places. Now, turning to have. So this again similar, options available, but I haven't, I've not, and then I ain't. And you see how neg and auxiliary contraction are rated quite as being quite frequent. There's a little bit more of a distinction between them, but again, pretty close. And there's not much in the way of regional variation. Maybe a little bit, but it's quite consistent because you see it's almost a straight line basically. But for ain't again, some variation. It follows sort of the same trajectories for B, which is quite interesting. You see the shape of the line, if you drew it down, would be similar. But what you will notice is that the average rating for have is slightly lower than it was for B for ain't. So basically, people find he ain't happy more common, acceptable than I ain't seen anybody. But where you notice a much bigger difference is with will. So here we don't have ain't as an option. It's either a choice between she won't go or she'll not go. And so generally across the board, she won't go is preferred. That's the red dot, much higher ratings across the board. And she'll not go is much less less common. However, we see some fluctuation, and particularly in the northeast, those two are very similarly rated, or at least auxiliary contraction is a lot more common. So she'll not go, and that chimes with my intuition being from the northeast that that's pretty common actually, but it seems much less so in other regions. I should say actually also, if you look at the north-south pattern for will, for auxiliary contraction, it does look like there could be a north-south pattern here. So perhaps Trudgill's claim does stand for will, even if it doesn't necessarily for some other verbs. What happens when we combine features? So there was a bunch of sentences that had different contraction options, and then with or without negative concord. So we're combining the two variables, two features that I've been talking about. So we've got I haven't seen anybody, I haven't seen nobody, I've not seen anybody, I've not seen nobody, I ain't seen anybody, I ain't seen nobody. Okay, so we've got systematic sort of cross tabulation, if you like, of the two features. So this is for have again, have contraction. So for auxiliary contraction, like I've not, very little regional variation. The main result here is just that if you have negative concord, they're lower rated, which is kind of what we'd expect because it's not standard. And neg contraction looks pretty much the same. Again, the dots are nearly all in roughly a straight line. Not a lot going on there. And then with ain't, so this is the distinction between I ain't seen anybody and I ain't seen nobody. You see how the dots come together, overlapping or on top of each other. So this means that basically people generally rate ain't quite low. And adding another non-standard feature like negative concord doesn't affect the rating any further. So it doesn't decrease it any further. It's pretty consistent. So people, if you don't use ain't, you're not going to use I ain't seen nobody, right? If you see what I mean. If you rate both low, you separately, you rate them both low together in this case. So coming back to our hypotheses, Trudgill's claim doesn't seem to be supported for B, but it did seem supported for will. The pattern for B that he's not would be more common than he isn't didn't seem to be supported because both types were rated quite similarly for the verb be. The claim for will that he won't would be preferred over he'll not was supported, and we did find, as had been suggested, that there's more regional variation there. And lastly, for ain't being more common in the South or Midlands than the North, that didn't seem to be supported in this data, at least not for have. I did have a brief look at for B. It didn't look like there was much there either in terms of a regional pattern, except for maybe being more common in London. So it's probably not a North-South Midlands thing, but that certain regions like London might use it more. And then the core variation issue, well, we saw that multiple non-standard forms coming together in the same sentence doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to rate them lower. But interestingly, in an earlier survey I did in 4 UK cities with working class people, they were asked a slightly different question, which was, how often do you think you would hear these sentences locally? So they went, instead of asking how frequently do you use it, how frequently do you think you would hear it? And there the results come out a little bit different, because when you have a sentence like I ain't seen nobody with ain't and negative concord, that was often rated higher than sentences with just one of those two forms. Okay, so the core variation between the two increased the acceptability. So it seems like in this case, combining non-standard features seem to index some kind of local identity for these working class people. And so then it has a kind of covert prestige. So this means, a non-standard feature having some kind of local value to the speakers who might use it or hear it. Whereas it's not overtly prestigious because neither ain't nor negative concord are part of standard English. But that in this case, it made people more accepting of it. So to finish up and pull out some concluding points, we've seen that the North-South divide is less of a divide. It's much less clear-cut for grammatical variation, at least for these features studied so far. And I will be looking at other features that were tested in the survey, but these were two of the main ones that I set out to look at. Social class is really important to think about alongside region, because when we're dealing with non-standard stigmatized features, there is, a class distinction, and so we need to disentangle that from any regional difference. And also, I hope to have shown that even in standard English, we have variation. So we can say she'll not, or we can say she won't. Both are standard English. And these can have regional patterning, even if it's not necessarily north-south. And just generally, grammatical variations often highly dependent on linguistic factors, often more so than social factors, or at least in addition to. So we can't just focus on the social, but as we saw with contraction, the verb type was really relevant to the distribution as well. So that's something that we always need to bear in mind. And that's it. So I've got some references. So if we send the recording out and you want to follow up on anything, you can. But thank you very much for listening. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. Will you be exploring the class patterns in future? Yeah, definitely. Because there's a whole, there's a bunch of people who said, I'm not sure what class I am, or say, I grew up in a working class family, but now I have a middle class job, and things like that. So we'd kind of call those people upwardly mobile, and how they would pattern would be quite interesting to look at, because do they kind of rate these sentences in the same way as the working class people do, because that's how they grew up? Or are they maybe harsher on them because they're now in a middle class job, right? And maybe they pay more attention to class based differentiation. I don't know. It's quite an interesting thing to look at. So yeah, I definitely will be looking at that. yeah, feel free to ask in the chat, or you can come on the mic if any of you have a working mic. Feel free to ask that way if it's easier, but you might not have access to that. Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for coming. This fit in well with our lesson on overt and covert prestige form. Oh, nice. I'm glad. I'm glad I mentioned that. I thought I'll throw that term in, and I wasn't sure if it was something that you would have been teaching on yet. So I'm glad it fitted in well with what you were doing.
Can I ask a question of the schools? Sorry, I phrased it.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know in the schools if you did you guess what the survey was about? Did you, when you were filling it in, now that you know there's this important thing about participants being naive to the purpose of the survey when they fill it out. They don't know what you're asking about. Did you guess, or does it make sense now with hindsight? Maybe too long ago.
There would be more regional markets. Yeah. I was quite surprised how little variation is on some of these. On the one hand, some of them, when it's a standard form, you think, okay, there's maybe not much going on regionally. But then some other things are so consistent. It's quite noticeable. And there's some other sentences in there. I mean, part of the project was about looking at these things that you think every English dialect should have this. But there'd been these claims about north-south patterning. So it was really setting out, like, is this a thing? Is there a north-south pattern or is it not? We thought it was wider, more about general grammatical correctness. Yeah. I've had a few people say that actually in the comments, because there was options to leave comments, and some people said, this is more about class than about region, which is, if it's a fair point, because that's kind of what I'm trying to investigate. That is there a true regional pattern, or is it all class based? So, I mean, did you pick up on the schools? Did you pick up on the interaction bit, like the covariation? Did you notice, oh, this sentence has two non-standard features in it? Or did you not really notice that as you were going through? No, didn't notice. Okay, that's quite reassuring to me actually, because
I'm gonna say, if you thought it was more general and you didn't notice these things, that shows that it was really well designed.
yeah, because there's always that risk that people pay too much attention to it and then they overthink it and start, thinking more prescriptively about these things. Yeah, no problem. You have to go. That's totally fine. We will finish on the hour, but yeah, thank you so much for being here. But yeah, I'm happy to hang on for another couple of minutes if you have any more comments or suggestions, any questions at all.
And there'll be an inevitable feedback form which you'll get by email. Excellent. Yeah.
Oh, that's fab. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I can maybe put the form in the chat actually. So yeah, this is the form, so you can copy and paste it to do it later. So there's this feedback form which I will send by email as well, so don't worry if you can't get it right now. And it's for staff and students. So if you're a teacher, we'd love you to fill it in. If you can distribute it to your students, we'd love that as well, just to get your feedback. Because we love to hear what you've done with you know, the survey and how it fits in with your teaching and how you found the talk. Yeah, and if there's anything else, you know, if we do future events, what would be useful as well, I think. So Sam has a project on London English, so you know,
Yeah, we're just starting a big project on multicultural London English. So that's going to be running for the next 3 years. So watch this space.
yeah, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming.